Thank you.
And a few words about Catherine. She has been an investment broker at Wall Street with Dylan and Co.
Dylan Reed.
Are they still around?
Oh, they're part of UBS.
Okay. And also Assistant Secretary for Housing under George Bush Sr. So, ladies and gentlemen, Catherine Austin Fitts.
Thank you. I've got my own.
I've got enough.
Thank you. How's that? Is that working? I was worried about the sound. Okay. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I had no idea that it was such an entrepreneurial crowd. I should have known, but it's wonderful. And I grew up in Philadelphia, so it's wonderful to hear those Philly accents. I mean, there was a bunch in the back. Raise your hand if you're from Philadelphia. All right. As Philip said, my name is Catherine Austin Fitts. I want to say a few words just in response to some of the speeches. I served as the Assistant Secretary of Housing in the first Bush administration, which was the cleanup for the last housing bubble bust. And one of the things I saw was that the industries that organized and used their associations to build market share and to seize on historical opportunities did so much better than the ones that didn't. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today is I do think that the BART industry has literally a historic opportunity. I mean, it's one of those moments when the door opens and for some period of time you can go through. But to do that, it's going to require organization and it's going to require a higher mind industry-wide. Now, essentially what I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and my 2 points during that 45 minutes are that the global financial system is literally breaking down. And I just want you to bear with me because, you know, that's not the most positive conversation. But it's literally breaking down. And I want to make that point as completely as I can so that you can see the opportunity and you can start to see where you can break through. So just bear with me. I'm going to try and talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to go into Q&A because I think there's going to be much more we can do in Q&A. So Rod has said we could go a little bit later if the questions are there. Okay, so let me get going. Let's see if, how do I work this? Let's try that. Okay, some smart guy at Yale took Geographic Information System software, and he mapped all the financial transactions on the planet and expressed them geographically. And if you can take a look at this picture, what you see are the spikes are where all the transactions are occurring. Now, one of the opportunities is to start to decentralize those transaction flows, because what's happening is if you map out the money in a community, and once upon a time, I had a company after I left the Bush administration that we built, we took relational database technology and geographic information software, and we literally mapped out all the sources and uses of federal credit and governmental flows. And what you saw was enormous centralization. Let me give you an example. I was sitting with a group of women in Tennessee about 2 years ago, and I'm always getting people to talk about how their money works, because, you know, in America, we very rarely share with each other how our money works. So I got these wonderful women to start talking about how their money works, and one was a retired school teacher, and she had her money in a local bank, in bank CDs, and their correspondent bank was a large New York bank whose name starts with a C, and she was getting about 3% on her CDs. And then the woman across from me had a 401k, and she was investing in the stock of the same large New York bank starting with a C. And then the woman on my right, and she figured she was getting about 5%. Now that was before this year when she's getting about negative 50%. And then the woman on my right had financed her business on her credit card, and her credit card was with the same New York bank starting with a C. And shortly after she did it, they raised the rate to 23%. So if you looked at how the money worked, these two women were providing capital to this large New York bank and getting about 4%. And one of their best friends was borrowing it back at 23%. Now, on Wall Street, we used to call that a 2,000 basis point arbitrage. Now, if you track out the money flows in this kind of centralization, what you're seeing is We're shipping our capitals into Central Point, and it's coming back with a huge spread. And so the opportunity is disintermediation. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the key trends of what's happening that particularly relate to the breakdown in the markets, and I'm going to do it with stories, because for me, stories are what really communicate what's going on. In 1989, it was the end of the last housing bubble burst. It was the S&L cleanup. Does everybody here remember what 1980? How many people here were doing barter in 1989? Okay. So I became Assistant Secretary of Housing, and I read the law. I'm always very good about reading the law that is the jurisdiction for anything I'm doing. I read the law, and it said that the Federal Housing Commissioner, I was the Federal Housing Commissioner, is required by law. They're the sole fiduciary for the FHA funds, which at that point were originating about $50 to $100 billion of mortgage insurance and had about $300 billion of outstanding. And it said we were required to run the single-family mortgage insurance fund on a self-supporting basis. So I walked into the office the first day, and the guy who ran the budget came in, and I said, I need to see our financial statements. And he said, well, we don't have financial statements. He said, we get audited by the General Accounting Office every couple of years, but that was a couple of years ago, so we don't have financial statements. And I said, well, we have a budget, right? He said, yes. I said, well, bring in the budget. So he brought in the budget, and if you put it on the floor, it would go about up to here with the budget justifications. And I read it 4 times in the speed reader, and I called him back in, and I said, nowhere in here does it say if we're making or losing money. And he said, well, that's not in the budget. And I said, well, where can I get that information? And he said, well, the accountants have it, but they report to a different assistant secretary, so you're not allowed to speak to them. Now, I had raised a great deal of money for George H.W. Bush, for which I apologize to all of you, but the reality is I got a pair of presidential cufflinks, and the accountants moved over to report to me. And so it took 2 months of lobbying, and by the time the accountants reported to me, they came in the first day, and it turned out that we were losing $11 million a day in the single-family fund. So I said to them, well, all real estate is local. Where are we losing the money? And he said, we don't know. We don't keep place-based information. And I said, well, this is an emergency. We mail out checks. We have zip codes. I want to see sources and uses of funds, of money in, money out by there are 10 regional districts and 80 field offices, and you've got to give directions to the field office managers if you're going to stop losing the $11 million a day. So it was a crash. They came back 2 months later, and it turned out we were making money in 8 regions and losing money in 2 regions. Can anybody guess where? It was Region 6 and 8. Region 6 had Texas and Arkansas. Anybody remember Iran-Contra? Turned out, I called the head of the federal Region 6 in our office, and I said, Sam, how much money do you think you lost last year? And he said, oh, I think we broke even. And I said, no, you lost $2 billion in 1988. He didn't know. So I faxed down the information. It turned out that literally what you had was you had a fraud epidemic. And the third bullet point here is financial fraud is policy. What we were doing was we were financing very significant covert operations and governmental policy through financial fraud. Okay, and that was 1989. Now, if you dig in, it's funny, when I worked as Assistant Secretary, Jack Kemp was the Secretary of HUD, and he used to call me in and he'd say, there's something fraudulent going on in this program, I want you to stop it. So I'd run out already to stop the program, and then he'd call in my deputy and he'd say, I just told Fitz to go stop this program and all this fraud, make sure she fails. Well, but why was that? The reason is, as a matter of public disclosure, we needed the system to look legitimate. As a matter of policy, we needed the cash flows to work. And let me tell you why, because it took me years to figure this out. In the summer of 2000, I was speaking to a wonderful group of people in Philadelphia called the Spiritual Frontiers Foundation International. And they have a conference once a year to talk about how to help our society evolve spiritually. Very well educated, committed people. And I was in the middle of this speech, and I was talking about how the Department of Justice the year before had told a reporter that I was helping with research that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion of all illegal cash flows. So it's mostly financial fraud, but tax evasion, narcotics trafficking, you name it, whatever. So we're the global leader in illegal money laundering. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually evolved people, what would happen if we stopped being the global leader in money laundering and that $500 billion to $1 trillion went to Zurich and Hong Kong and Singapore and other places, not here? So we had a little conversation and they said, well, the stock market would go down and we'd have trouble financing the government deficit. So our taxes might go up or our government checks might stop. So I said, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern. And if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your community and your state and your country tomorrow, thus offending the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion of illegal money. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, guess how many would push the button? 1. So I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? Why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our government checks to stop. And we don't want our mutual funds to go down. And we don't want our taxes to go up. Now, that's what I call the red button problem. The opportunity is to turn the red button green, and that starts with decentralizing a lot more flows, economic flows, into your local area, okay? Now, what's the problem in Washington? So let's say you're the candidate for the President of the United States, and congratulations, you've won the election in November, and you walk into the Oval Office in January. What does everybody in America want from you? They want their check, right? Okay, so you call in your Secretary of the Treasury, who no doubt was a former chairman of Goldman Sachs. You know, it just keeps happening. What are they going to tell you? To get the check, you have to be nice to the people who control $500 billion to $1 trillion of money laundering, right? So can you tell those people to go jump in a lake? You've got the red button problem. And in fact, in America, if you're going to have a change, you need about an 80% consensus to effect a change. So if you're going to push the red button, you need 80% of the American people to support you in doing so. So let me ask the question, how many people here would push the red button? Now, I just want to tell you, if we all push the red button, there'll be a lot more barter opportunities. Okay, so let me expand that sort of analysis. What we have in America, does anybody remember Dick Cheney saying deficits don't matter? Okay. What we have in America is we've created a phenomenally exquisite global financial mechanism where we sell countries around the world treasury securities and currency, and the value of it goes down. So we print more money, we get them to take the money, the value goes down, and what we've created is a global taxation system which is financing us through the balance sheets around the world, okay? And as you watch the geopolitical tensions of these bailouts, what you're seeing is countries around the world being more and more frustrated with buying paper that's either fraudulent or simply because we're monetizing so much is dropping in value, okay? And we're literally watching an integration of military and economic warfare because essentially they're buying our paper because we have the weapons, okay? And it's literally a fantastic integration of those two things. Now, in one sense, nothing's new because we've been operating, the Western world's been operating on the central banking warfare model for 500 years, which is the central banks print paper, the military makes sure people hold it and enforce liquidity. Now, what's happening that's different? I was in London in, when was it? In 2000. And I gave a paper called, it was in an investment conference. So we're sitting in the, you know, in the room with all the portraits of the ancestors around. It's very, very stuffy. And I gave a paper called The Myth of the Rule of Law about centralization using mortgage fraud in this country. and how the mortgage markets were being used to literally flood communities with credit in a way that centralized political and economic control. I gave that paper, and then John Laughlin, who's a very respected journalist in London, got up and gave a paper on a similar process going on in Eastern Europe. And then Ann Williamson, who was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal in Russia during the 1990s, got up and gave a paper about a very similar process going on in Russia. And what we realized was that we were literally looking at the same group of investors and the same corporations who were moving around the world and centralizing economic political power in a way that shifted assets out of communities and out of sovereign governments into corporations. So we were literally privatizing assets and shifting them out of government to corporations, and we were doing it in a process where the corporations were getting the assets at below market value and shifting liabilities back into the government with no compensation to the government. So I'll give you an example. What we're watching on the bailouts is the investment banks make a fortune on derivatives and then shift all the liability back into the government. So if I make money, I get to keep it. If I lose money, I shift it back to the government. And so literally we're watching one of the largest asset transfers in history out of sovereign governments and into a relatively small handful of private investors and private banks. Now, as that happens, what is happening is called the slow burn. Does anybody feel drained in the last 10 years? Do you ever wonder what that feeling, that drain is? I call it the slow burn because in the process what we're doing is we're printing money in a process where the insiders are protected, but the outsiders bear the brunt of a very sneaky kind of inflation. At the same time, we're using globalization and literally being able to go around the world, use technology to grab cheap labor, to deflate the value of labor. Now, the $64 question in this process is, can we shift to a sustainable economy? Because if we don't, the force that it will take to continue to keep the current system going is going to be greater and greater. One of the two big wild cards are going to be technology. There's tremendous suppressed technology in the area of energy and healthcare. And the other $64 question we're going to talk a lot about this morning is, will the United States government default on its debt? Because it has two choices. It can default, or it can continue to use its military to make the system go. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the slow burn. Can I get some water? Sorry about all the numbers on this chart. Let's say in 2003, if I had bought a CD or a bond, a 5-year CD or bond, in dollars, that yielded 5%, okay? And every year I got my income after tax of $360, and at the end of 5 years I got my principal back, so I got my $10,000 back. Okay, so that's a successful investment, right? You put your money in, you get your 5%, you get your money back. Now, if you look at the second investment, if I had instead put that money into a bullion trust, so I go to my brokerage account and I simply arrange to buy a fund that holds silver and gold, get hardly any dividend, but let's just say I sold every year enough to get me my equivalent current yield. At the end of that period, I would have had, instead of $10,000, I would have had $20,000. Let's say I pay my taxes, I have $17,000. Okay, if I'd done the same with digital gold, I'd have approximately the same amount of money. Okay, now let's say that we measure the value of my investment not in dollars, but in my purchasing power, and we'll use a gallon of gasoline. If you look at the top line, when I started out with my $10,000, I could buy 7,000 gallons of gasoline. At the end, after taxes, I can still buy 7,000 gallons of gasoline, okay? If I had kept my investment in dollars, I can buy 3,000 gallons of gasoline. Now, what that meant was, if you take a household of 2 parents, some kids, grandparents, and you count up all the money from 2003 to 2008 that they have sitting in dollars, in bank CDs, in a money market account, in a U.S. Denominated bond fund. You know, so let's say a family has $250,000 in dollar-denominated fixed income assets and cash during that period. How much have they lost in purchasing power? $250,000. Okay, whatever their balance was. This is what the slow burn looks like, because what you're watching is a falling dollar that is literally draining the economic value of any household who holds a lot of paper. Now, if you wander around a community and you add up not just the household, but the churches and the various institutions in the municipality, you can go into a small county of about 100,000 people, and literally during this period, they've lost about $3 billion or more in purchasing power. It's an extraordinary number, okay? To look at it another way, this is a chart that James Turk, the founder of Gold Money, did about a year ago. And what the bottom line is he's pricing the price of oil in gold grams, which is a unit of gold. And then the blue line on top is dollars. And so, you know, there's been great discussion in the press about the price of oil is going up. What a lot of us who do a lot with precious metals feel is the price of oil is not going up, rather the value of the dollar is going down. Okay. One of the things we're going to see in the bailout is a real discussion about the role of the banks, because when you look at the centralization of economic and political power, and you look at using financial fraud as a vehicle to do that, the banks play a major role. And let me give you a couple of examples. I was, in 1996, I had a company in Washington, and I had a wonderful board on one of the subsidiaries that was about 20 of the top leaders in the pension fund industry in this country. And it was spring of 1997. And I met with them in April 1997 to give them a presentation on how we could re-engineer government investment by community, which is one of the great opportunities to significantly improve the health and financial wealth of communities. And the president of CalPERS, which is the largest pension fund in the country, it's the California Public Employee Pension, looked at me and he said, "You don't understand. It's too late. They've given up on the country and they're moving all the money out in the fall." Now, that was the fall of 1997 is the beginning of federal fiscal 1998. Now, what started to happen in federal fiscal 1998 is that huge amounts of money started to go missing from the U.S. government, that we have counted so far $4 trillion. The federal government was required by law starting in 1995 to produce audited financial statements. To this date, has never produced audited financial statements. So literally, we have a government with absolutely no financial accountability. Now, if your company started to engage in massive illegal transactions, what would happen? If you were publicly traded, the SEC would stop allowing your stock to be traded. But more importantly, the bank would stop affecting your transactions. So if $4 trillion went missing from the federal government from 1998 to 2001, who affected those transactions? Well, who's the depository for the U.S. government? It's the New York Fed Bank. And who owns the New York Fed member bank? It's members, right? Okay. So who are the biggest leaders, members of the New York Fed? Well, it's J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of New York, et cetera. Okay, now, so what we have is a group of large banks who, as depository for the U.S. government, have affected massive amounts of unconstitutional transactions. Now, I put another statistic up here that I want you to hear. In 2004, Northern Trust estimated that U.S. households had a deficit of $342 billion. In fact, at that time, we were doing analysis at the Bureau of Statistics on households, and what we found was that the average household had about $5,000 more a year in expenses than it had income, and the vast majority of that was coming by taking on more debt or liquidating assets. So the U.S. banks in that year household had $342 billion in deficits, operating deficits. The top 20 banks that year had income of $89 billion. So what you're literally seeing is you're seeing a financial system that's out of alignment, okay? Because the banks are making money while the broad population is losing money. And that's very much related to both the fraud going on in the U.S. finances and the fraud going on in things like the mortgage industry. Okay, so let's get to the mortgage bailout. In 1989, what we saw was a cleanup of a system, a situation very much like the one we have now, but a little bit more significant. And let me tell you one last story. In 1995, my company was working as the financial advisor to the Federal Housing Administration. And a wonderful gentleman came in who was a mortgage broker, and we had just seen the federal government try to publish their first financial statements, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the FHA had published their first attempt at financial statements. And he had a copy of them, and he came in to see me and he said, "My family has been in the mortgage banking business for 3 generations. And our core competency is we track all FHA mortgages and related securities, so Ginnie Mae securities or any securities securitized with FHA mortgages." And he said, he brought me a stack of paper. He said, "I brought my database for you, a copy of my database." And he said, "There's been a terrible mistake." And he said, "If you look at the number of outstanding FHA mortgages in these new financial statements, it's terribly wrong." And I said, "What do you mean it's wrong?" And he said, "The actual amount outstanding is many multiples of this." Now, I thought he was crazy, because what he was saying was the Treasury and HUD and the New York Fed were engaged in massive securities fraud. Now, I won't go into all the details right now. It took me many years of research to come to the conclusion that he was probably right, and I wish I'd taken a copy of the database. The reality is, what we've been watching is a mortgage market where we have several different kinds of fraud going on. The first and foremost is fraudulent inducement. Who here knows what fraudulent inducement is? Okay. Fraudulent inducement, if I know something about your financial situation that you don't. So for example, let's say I'm a large bank, and I know that we're in the process of moving a huge amount of jobs abroad, and that your income is likely to fall, or the general income in your community is likely to fall. So I make you a loan, and I know something significant about your financial situation that you don't, and I don't disclose it. That is a material omission, okay? And it may be a criminal act. Now, if you take on that debt and I've committed that material omission, under the law, you may not owe back the money, or you may not owe back all of it, okay? Now, what I will tell you as a former Assistant Secretary of Housing, in the mid-90s, we knew that America needed to pay down its debt, not increase its debt. We knew households could not take on this kind of debt, and we knew if we bubbled the economy that it would be temporary, okay? Now, in fact, what we did is we bubbled the economy, and we encouraged people to take on massive amounts of debt that we knew they couldn't afford, not just in poor neighborhoods. It was in poor neighborhoods too. I'll never forget, in 1994, I was privy to the projections of how much debt was going to be issued for FHA and Freddie and Fannie in 96, 97, and 98. And I said to the government official, I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "You know, you're saying," I said, "literally, in these neighborhoods, everybody's going to have to refinance their mortgage twice a year, including from prison. I mean, there are not enough people to do this." And she looked at me and she said, "Shut up, this is none of your business." So this was a matter, the fraudulent inducement was a matter of policy. The second thing that happened is, my prediction is what we're watching mortgages that are being put into multiple pools. So I put a mortgage on a home, and I end up putting the same mortgage in 10 different mortgage pools. Okay, so very significant collateral fraud. Now, then the third kind of fraud, which is the most dangerous, is, so let's take fraudulently induced mortgages, let's pool them into mortgage pools where there's significant collateral fraud, and then what do we put on top of it? Derivatives. Okay, so you literally have an upside down pyramid where the person in the real economy who's got to finance not just these pools, but the derivatives, doesn't begin to have the economic power to carry that kind of leverage. Okay, so we're in a situation where now the mortgage, the bubble is collapsed, and I should just point out, while the bubble was going, what happened? We bubbled the economy and it supports a higher dollar. What happened from 1995 to 2005 while we did that? $10 trillion of capital left the United States at a high dollar. Where did it go? Reinvested in the emerging markets. So we pulled this out while it's high and shifted abroad. Now that the bubble's over, what's going to happen? We don't have that base of capital. See an opportunity for barter? No, not yet. Okay. The IMF says, and I'm not trying to tell you that this is the most legitimate source, but the IMF sticks by their prediction that $1 trillion needs to be written off in the mortgage market. If $1 trillion needs to be written off, then what we're going to see is tremendous consolidation. We've watched Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers consolidate in. During this period, it's funny, one of the things that happens to me is a lot of people will tell me, I'll look at their financials and I'll say, why are you still banking, or why do you still have your brokerage business with that firm? I mean, that firm they were involved in Enron, they were involved in the missing money from the federal government, they were involved in all these different activities. And they'll say, oh, well, I'm a very important, prestigious person, they would never do that to me. So this is one of my favorite stories. The Maher brothers sold their business on the ports of New Jersey. So you would think that they would know what was up. They took approximately they took $600 million, invested it with Lehman Brothers in July of 2007, who promptly put it in auction securities that went to zero in value. Okay? Okay, so Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Was anybody here an investor in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? Who here has a money market fund? Okay. Anybody who has a money market fund as an investor is probably an investor in Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie their shares went from about $68 at the beginning of the year, the high for this year, down to they're both trading below $1. It's $100 billion of stock market value lost. And what I want to tell you now is one of the most important points I could make in this presentation. Dodge & Cox. Does anybody here have Dodge & Cox mutual funds in their portfolio? No? Dodge & Cox is based in San Francisco. They're one of the most respected mutual fund companies in the country. Dodge & Cox, at the beginning of the year, owned about $12 million of Fannie Mae stock shares. And Fannie Mae got in trouble, and Dodge & Cox increased their position to 119 million shares, or 12% of Fannie Mae. So they bought 12% of Fannie Mae in the last 6 months. Okay? Now, let me tell you why I think Dodge & Cox would buy 12%. It's over $1 billion of investment this year in Fannie Mae. Why I think they would do it. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac essentially, by this year, had 70 to 80% of the market share of securitizations of U.S. mortgages. That's essentially a monopoly position, and it's a position even in a recession or a depression, gives you incredible pricing power. Okay, you cannot lose money doing that. In addition, they had access to the federal credit. They had a line of credit at the Treasury, and they were traded in the marketplace essentially as an indirect credit of the U.S. government. Okay, now if that's the case, you can, as a practical matter, as a business model, you cannot go down. Okay, but what happened? So you have all the smart guys at Dodge & Cox, they do all the analysis, they realize this is a great opportunity. They put $1 billion of their fund money into Fannie Mae, and yet it goes down. This just happened a month ago. What happens when that happens? Dodge & Cox realizes that something not legitimate is going on. In other words, the only way this company cannot stand on its own and cannot make money is if there is very significant fraud going on. Okay? Now, I'm assuming that that was very new news to Dodge & Cox, because otherwise they wouldn't have put $1 billion of their fund money into Fannie Mae. Now, when you think about it, I'm a former Assistant Secretary of Housing in the first Bush administration. My company was the lead financial advisor to FHA for many years. I've been on record as saying that there is serious and systemic fraud in the mortgage portfolio, as have many other people for years, and yet Dodge & Cox this year still didn't realize that. Okay? So why am I saying this? It's very important to understand what's now going to happen in the markets with the bailout, because you had the majority of the traditional mainstream investment community in America not knowing that there was something seriously wrong. But 30 days ago, they discovered that, in fact, something was seriously wrong. Now, that's a paradigm shift, not for us, but for them. And what's important to understand is the minute that paradigm shift happens to their pocketbook and then to their perspective, what has to happen? About $1 trillion needs to leave here and come over here quickly, and of course, that's what we're seeing. As soon as that realization started to spiral out into the marketplace, what we've started to see is the equivalent not of a bank run, but an everything run. Okay, now, Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, who here has read the bailout language that was published this weekend? Okay, the New York Times put the proposed U.S. Treasury bailout language up on its website this weekend, and it set off a storm. Let me just read you Section 8. The bailout language proposes that the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury be given a line of credit slightly less than $1 trillion, $700 billion, and with that line of credit, they can buy any asset they want, essentially. So any debt of any foreign or domestic bank on any price they want, and they can hire and pay anybody they want outside of governmental process and laws to help them do it. And they can pay them whatever they want in whatever manner they want. Okay, so it's complete dictatorial powers, and Section 8 reads as follows. Decision by the Secretary of the Treasury pursuant to the authority of this act are non-reviewable and committed to agency discretion and may not be reviewed by any court of law or any administrative agency. Okay. Now, what that means is if I'm the Secretary of the Treasury and I need to buy significant derivatives and mortgage pools that were fraudulently issued and that are, of course, worthless, but I need everyone in the planet to not know that, because the last thing I want to do is destroy the legitimacy of the system. That's how you do it. Okay? Now, we've just seen MoveOn this morning, it was yesterday or this morning, put out a new petition called No Blank Check. And in fact, the Democrats, Obama has now come out and said no blank check. And so this is going to set off a storm. What we've been watching as the storm is going on is tremendous, literally a tremendous run on money market accounts and a real shift of investment starting out of things that are supported by the federal credit and into things which are real. Let me give you an example. day to day to day, I'm an investment advisor, and I get the same portfolios coming into me over and over again, and here's what they look like. I just looked at one Monday. A couple $1 million, and you say you have $1 million in stocks, you have $1 million in bonds, and then you've got some money in money markets and some miscellaneous other things. Now, it looks like it's managed according to traditional portfolio theory, and it looks like it's very diversified. You have lots of different kinds of companies and lots of different kinds of industries and lots of different kinds of governmental and corporate bonds, right? In fact, there's only one security in that portfolio, because every corporation is dependent on U.S. government contracts and purchases and U.S. government financing. So all the companies are highly dependent on the federal budget. And then if you look at all the bonds are dependent on the U.S. federal budget, whether it's because they're corporate and they depend on government contracts, or they're governmental and they depend on the Fed. Now, so all these, so let's say we have 200 securities, and every one of them depends on the federal government passing a budget on October 1st that keeps pumping the subsidies into all those different companies and governmental agencies. And then all of them depend on going out and borrowing more money to finance those activities. And all that borrowing depends on Hank Paulson being able to keep the system going. Okay, now what happens if the federal government, what happens if the Chinese and the Russians and everyone say, we're tired of buying stinky Fannie Mae paper, we're going to stop? What would happen? All those companies, all those municipalities, all those government agencies, all those corporate bonds would be completely, would go from something to almost nothing in value overnight. Okay? So that's what I mean by centralization. Centralization is all the economic activity in your, whether it's your investment portfolio or your community, is highly dependent on one centralized source of funding, which is unbelievably fragile and unstable. Okay? Now, what we're seeing is money leave things that are that unstable and going into what? They're going into things that are real. Right, so they're going into commodities, but it's anything that's real. Now, where's the opportunity for barter? Okay, you're in the business of transacting real services and goods to real people, right? Okay, so let's talk about what the areas of opportunity are going to be. And I want to look at this from the point of view not of any particular industry, but of an individual household who's faced with this situation. One of the best investments you can make in this environment is personal self-sufficiency. Why should I put my money in a insecure financial system, earn a yield that is increasingly more and more problematic, then take that money and go off and try and buy food, water, and shelter from a bunch of corporations who I don't trust? Why not instead start to invest, so let's disintermediate. Why not take the money and invest locally or through my network in things that can provide me with the basic goods and services I and my family need, and just forget about this financial intermediation thing? Okay, so suddenly investing to create the network you need for goods and services becomes much more attractive, both as a personal thing, but literally as a financial investment. Now, anybody who's ever tried to build personal self-sufficiency, the first thing they know is it gets a lot more fun if your community, if your family, if other people around you are doing it. And I would think that that's one of the areas where barter networks could really come in, particularly if your network is not just about transacting, but building community. Okay? Because people really want to find like-minded people and really want to start doing these kinds of things in this environment. Banking intimate. In 1998, I was writing a check on, I had an account at the J.P. Morgan Personal Wealth Group, and J.P. Morgan Chase is the largest bank at HUD, and I was writing the check, and I said, why am I banking at the bank who's running HUD on the, this is crazy. I need to find an honest bank. I now bank at one of the smallest banks on the planet. And it's funny, my ATM card will work all over the world. So I can bank at the smallest bank on the planet, but work all over the world. One of the things we're seeing as the credit crunch unfolds and the legitimacy of the system starts to spiral down is people say, where can I bank that's safe? And it's not enough to have FDIC insurance. You need to have a bank that's really in the business of circulating money locally in a way that's sound. You need a bank with a real banking business that can survive with something other than just federal credit. Precious metals, I doubt I need to talk. How many people here invest in precious metals? Familiar with precious metals? Okay, one of the things you discover as you travel around the world that 6 billion people agree on is that gold and silver are money. And so gold and silver are not really investment, they're kind of a safe haven alternative currency in this environment. Natural resources for obvious reasons. Healthy places. It is going to become more and more important that your place is a place that's run in an adult manner. So what we're watching, for example, in the sovereign bond market is the credits in governments that are financially responsible but culturally responsible are becoming far more attractive than U.S. government securities. So place is going to matter tremendously, particularly on governmental credits. And finally, enterprises that are excellent at real solutions, because what people really want are real solutions. I'm doing a conference in Tennessee in October called Financial Permaculture, and it's a wonderful group of young entrepreneurs who are all into green. So finally I said to one of them, you know, what does green really mean? And she said, green equals no waste. And I think one of the great opportunities over the next 10 years are going to be where are the organizations that help us apply new technology to really reduce waste and to shift us to a much more physically sustainable society. Now, if you and I were to walk around your neighborhood or my neighborhood, what we would discover is that if you look at all the pockets of capital within a community, whether it's the money that is reserved at the local municipality or the endowment at the local university or the reserves at the church or somebody else's 401k, what you will see is all the money is currently going into this very centralized economy that we've been talking about. So it's going into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac securities, it's going into US Treasuries, it's going into large US corporations, it's going into all the things that Hank Paulson with his bailout bill is trying to protect. And the real opportunity is, can it start to shift? Now, when I look at an investment portfolio, I divide things up between local and global and liquid and non-liquid. The traditional American portfolio has everything liquid and global, but they're not going globally direct, so they're not going directly to New Zealand or they're not going directly to New Jersey. I mean, to Germany, they're going into a large US corporation that is then going global. Now, what we're going to see happening, it's happening now, but it's going to accelerate, and I get back, this is again the opportunity for barter. What you're seeing is money pulling out of the liquid, large corporation, large cap global, and saying, how can I do more local? How can I go global, because everybody still wants to go global, but how can I get out of the dollar and go global, but by going direct? So I don't want to invest in IBM that will then invest in New Zealand. I want to invest directly in a New Zealand stock. So we're going to keep going global, but it's going to be less intermediation. Then the last thing that's going to happen, again an opportunity for barter, is a lot more money is saying, you know, the liquid markets are this unstable and this crazy, I want to do more non-liquid. And it's not just I want to do more non-liquid locally, but I want to do more non-liquid globally. So where do I find the networks of trust that can help me go into these, you know, these new markets and these new networks that I don't know? Okay, so where's the opportunity for barter? One, the value of the corporate brand is diminishing, because if the corporate brand was reliable, whether it's a bank, whether it's a media company, whether it's a large corporation, this couldn't be happening. Okay? The corporate brand has risen with significant amounts of fraud as its source of capital. So the corporate brand is going to diminish. In 1989, what we saw in the marketplace when we were cleaning up the last housing bubble bust is we saw the credit crunch unfolded, and we saw a lot less liquidity for the small guy. The large corporations could get equity capital, but the little guy didn't have liquid capital. He couldn't go into the stock market, and his bank financing got cut off. Okay? And it was the basis of the large corporations buying up a huge amount of market share. So one of the opportunities is, can we create liquidities for households and small business? It's going to be an opportunity. Networks of trust. In a healthy financial system, people simply follow institutions to get capital and do business. What we're watching is people step back and say, you know, I can't trust a lot of these systems. Where is a network of trust that I can move through? So we're watching more activity go through family networks or tribal networks, more things go through faith-based networks. Faith-based networks, my prediction, is going to be increasingly important. In addition, we're going to watch a shift to essential goods and services. I don't know if there's a way to create barter networks around organic food or food grown naturally, but if there is, there's a way to make a fantastic amount of money. The shift is going to be, how do I get all the critical essential services I need for life that are reliable? Because the deterioration is not just in the financial community, the deterioration is in the quality of the goods and services provided corporate. So there's a distrust growing on the corporate brand to provide those things, and that's the opportunity if we can find ways of providing them. One of the big risk issues, my prediction is barter is going to grow and grow a lot. One of the big risk issues as we grow is the traditional channel is going to be losing that economic flow to barter. And believe me, I can tell you from personal experience, they don't always play nice. Okay? So one of the issues we have to think about is, and this is where an association plays an important role, because you have to be impeccable about legal compliance, you have to be impeccable about taxation in this kind of environment, because economic warfare is going to be at hand. And so how do you make sure you stay below the radar of the traditional systems, and if you're vulnerable to attack by them, how do you handle it? Alternative currencies could be very important. The question is, how do we make them not susceptible to financial fraud? And one of the reasons I do so much with precious metals is one that doesn't require a lot of complex organization. You can just do a community currency by the Just Do It method. Okay, let's talk about the next 12 months. October 1st, we have a new federal budget. November 4th, we have an election. December 31st is the year-end close. That's when a lot of the numbers get finalized. March 15th, the investors have to file disclosure dates. Pension funds have to let everybody know how much money they lost. We have corporate taxes and then individual taxes. And then summer's always slow, right? So my prediction is, remember, if you look at what's going on now in the financial markets, this is the period when we're holding things together for the election. So let me give you an example. In 1988, the summer of 1988, George Gould was the #2 guy at Treasury, and he came up to Dillon Read. I was a partner at Dillon Read, and he said, you know, we're just holding things together with Band-Aids till after the elections. And the chairman of my firm then went in to become Secretary of the Treasury early in September to kind of help with the Band-Aid process. And it was really after the election and inauguration that literally all hell broke loose. And it was by August I was sitting in the Treasury with Greenspan and Nick Brady, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and we really didn't know if the RTC auctions were going to work. August was when we passed the law for the RTCs. Things were very fragile, and at that point the economy was much stronger and much less centralized than it is today. So if anybody tells you that we're at the end of this cleanup, we're just at the beginning. Because this is the period when we're holding things together until after the election. And the big question after the election is what will happen to the federal credit? And that's a geopolitical issue and it's a military issue. It's got nothing to do with domestic politics at this point, because our financing is not coming from the United States, it's coming from around the world. What that means is, between the election and by the end of next year, anything you can do to create liquidity for small business and households could be an incredible market share opportunity. And you could also do a huge amount of good in the world, because most American households and most American small business are not prepared for what is about to happen. Okay, I'm going to be speaking, I'll look very sober. I'm going to be speaking on the panel on community currencies later today. I have a website, Solari.com. You can sign up for updates. We have a blog where we post information to follow the markets every day. So if you're interested in following the financial markets, but the deeper news on the financial markets, definitely stop by the blog. We have a store. I do audio seminars. For example, our latest one is called Positioning Your Assets for Growth in Uncertain Times. And what it does, it's from the point of view of a household, and the whole focus is preserving family wealth. And it's got a transcript, a resource page with lots of resources. And we literally go through the areas of opportunities and do a before and after portfolio and show you how to shift out of sort of the economy of force and into real things in a way which really completely repositions your portfolio to grow and be protected in this kind of environment. We have, we just loaded affiliate software, and we allocate 10% of sales, gross sales, to affiliates. So if any of you have websites and would be interested in becoming an affiliate, we'd love to talk to you. Finally, day-to-day, what I do is investment advisory services, and you can learn more about that at solariadvisors.com. Okay, well, this is my favorite part, because what happened to me was, I had a very successful company in Washington in the 1990s and made the mistake of trying to persuade people not to do the housing bubble. We, among other things, we had built software technology that would allow communities to map out sources and uses of government money. And if you look at the opportunity in the economy, let's say we were to go to any county in America, and we mapped out the sources and uses of government investment in that community, what we would find is that it had a negative return on investment. So we're paying people, we're paying companies, we're paying organizations a great deal of money to do things that make us more stupid, okay, and that don't have fundamental economic productivity. And if you could re-engineer that in a way that had capital gains for the small businesses and productive entities in that place, there's fantastic amount. I mean, forget the debt problem. There's a way out if we could do that. Anyway, so we were making the software technology. And has anybody here ever seen the movie Enemy of the State with Will Smith and Gene Hackman? Okay, well, I played Will Smith in real life. Because what happened was, you could, if that software had been accessible through the internet, you couldn't have had a housing bubble. And essentially, the Department of Justice seized our offices and seized the software, and it took me 6 years to get it back. And by that point, the most valuable pieces of it had disappeared. They'd been stolen out of court control. And that's when I discovered that things were not as they seem. Because one of the reasons I could never believe that all this mortgage fraud was going on is, how could it go on and me not know about it if I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing? So, you know, the hardest thing to do is to look into the mirror and say, you know, I'm the patsy here. But what that started was a process of research trying to find out how all this fraud could be going on, and most people not aware of it. So I literally started a project of figuring out how are they financing the matrix. And in that process, what I discovered was, you know, I ended up having access to some of the best reporters in the world, not just on financial fraud, but on energy, suppressed energy technology and healthcare technology. I'll give you an example. John Rappaport is one who I listen to a lot. But I also ended up working with a series of different scientists who've been working with alternative energy technology. And so I'm not an expert on those things. I just depend on the people that I've gotten to know. And literally, if you look at what is available through, you know, that we know of, say the technology of someone like a Royal Rife, I don't know if you're familiar with him, or, you know, the technology to deal with all these problems is available. Anybody who tries to bring them out and apply them finds themselves having trouble getting capital, or if they're successful without a lot of capital, they find themselves dealing with the kind of dirty tricks I dealt with. And so we're watching an economy where there's certain control points. One is oil and energy, one is capital, one is, healthcare technology. So we're watching tremendous political control and enforcement through dirty tricks. If you haven't seen the movie Syriana, I really recommend it to you. It's George Clooney was instrumental in making it. And it really shows you the dilemma of a business or governmental leader who wants to change things for their population and is literally stopped from doing it by the kind of covert warfare that is really ruling the planet. So literally, if a business or governmental leader can't implement these new technologies without a missile coming down on them and their family, or their software being seized for 6 years, et cetera, it's very hard to roll these things out. But the reason they're not accessible is politics. It has nothing to do with technology or science.
How would you say that the Asian Pacific and the European community should position themselves in relation to the USA?
The way to position yourself is to do anything you can to build up your real economy. What we're watching is, for several decades now, we've been in what investors would call a bull market for financial assets. And we've invested tremendous brain power and technology in financial engineering. And we're shifting now into a world where there's going to be a bull market for tangible assets, and where the greatest opportunities are going to be those companies and those economies that can take new technology and literally reduce waste and build a sustainable economy. That's where the big equity capital gains is going to be. And so wherever we are, it's what a friend of mine used to say, it is what it is. What you want to do is you want to invest for the long term in converting to a sustainable economy and being masters of the real economy, because that's where the power is going to come. The power is going to come in that ability, and Asia is very well positioned to do that. And if you look not just at Asia, at China and India, the countries with the big growth, if you look at the derivative economies, Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, they're all positioned very well. Any economy that has, if you look at my positioning audio seminar, I have a list of characteristics of countries that are going to do well in this environment. But it's going to be any economy that builds in the long-term human and intellectual capital of its own people. And that's one of the reasons that the States is in real trouble, is we have not invested in the human and intellectual capital of our own people. So if I was Europe and Asia, I would do everything I could to insulate myself from the adjustment that the US has to make, and I would focus on building the real economy. Now, if that means getting technology from the United States, I would do it. But right now, the United States is not a stable partner, and let me go to the root of the problem, because the root of the problem is not financial. I used to love those old Clint Eastwood westerns. I don't know if anybody ever saw them, but Clint Eastwood rides into town, and the place is a mess, and you got most people over at the salon fighting, and prostitutes hanging out with half their clothes not on, and the kids have to play in the street because it's, and there's dirt all over, it's a messy. And the hardware store is pathetic and doesn't have inventory, so who can farm because who can get the tools? And, the whole place is just a mess. And imagine you're Clint Eastwood, you're riding into town, and somebody comes out and tries to sell you a mortgage bond collateralized by the mortgage on the salon and says, "Don't worry, pal, it's government guaranteed." Well, is the problem economic? No. The problem is cultural. The problem is ethical. Some would say, I would say the problem is spiritual. But the way you grow a great civilization is one child at a time and one family at a time. And there are no shortcuts. Yes, there's technology, there are things you can do. But what is going on in this country is we have built a financial mechanism and economy based on force. And the problem with doing that as an operational matter is the more force you use, the more decisions are driven politically instead of by fundamental economic productivity. And so we're in a spiral down. And the question for the Americans in the room is, how do we spiral back up? How do we get out of that? So my answer is, if I were Asia and Europe, I would do whatever I had to do in my place and network with other countries to build up the real economy. And the thing I would keep a watchful eye on is we're coming into a period where the geopolitics of forcing people to buy more treasuries as they decline 5% every period is potentially going to get very violent, and the politics of oil is mixed into that. And so the danger is, can we go through this next 12 to 20 months without significant global violence? And I don't know the answer to that question.
What can the average American family do? These problems just seem so big, like nothing, so I'm sitting here overwhelmed. What can I do? My husband makes $45,000 a year, I make $45,000 a year, you know, we're living on almost $100,000 a year, 4 kids, our own house. What do we all do? Top 3 things.
The first thing you need to do is protect your time, because we're going into the nature of this environment is more and more things go on in the environment that eat up your time unexpectedly. So, and I'm just going to be tough to the Americans in the room. I was at a dinner party about 2 years ago, and it was a guy from the GAO office in Washington, and he was very depressed, and finally I turned to him and I said, "What is your problem?" And he said, "I just got the new Census Bureau statistics." He said, according to the latest community survey, the average American watches 8.5 hours of TV a day. Do you watch TV? No? Okay. The first thing we need to do is protect our time. So what I would do is I would try and budget a couple of hours a week, and the more people in your family or your community you can do it with, and start to say, what is it we can do to shift? Let's look at all the critical things I need, whether it's food, water, and every place is different, so it's hard to make generic rules that umbrella everyone, but what can I do to start accessing more and more of my essential services locally? And what can I do to organize with other people here to start, whether it's buying things together or financing a local farmer, there are thousands of different things. And start to go through and figure out how you can reduce your dependency on any large organization. That's what you want to do. You want to make sure that you are transacting with ethical people in every aspect of your life, and to the extent that you can organize locally around a good local bank or great local farmers or whatever. Every place is different. And so I would really attend to that. Now, one of the things you can also do is I will tell you for the next 12 months that stockpiling non-perishables will probably have a better after-tax yield than any other liquid investment you could make, okay? And so, don't put money in a money market or don't put money in a CD when you can make sure you've stockpiled in your home whatever you need. Because if we do get a hiccup in the financial system, if we do get another 9/11, you're gonna feel great to have done those stockpilings. So the first thing I would do is take the time to invest in making sure that you've reduced your financial or operational dependency on any large organizations, okay?
Is this whole culture of fraud unique to the United States?
The question was, is the culture of fraud unique to the United States? Right. The fraud that we're dealing with in many respects is global. The sophisticated financial fraud is much more the first world than the emerging markets, because it's created here, it's engineered here. I would say that the U.S., my bet is that it's probably worse here because we've been so good at it. And if you look at the history of governmental policy in this area, a lot of the financial fraud in the last 50 years has really day-to-day been organized with a partnership of the New York Fed and the Treasury, and I have to say what I saw at HUD was a matter of state policy. So it's very ingrained in the system, And that's why, for some of us, when you first look at it, it feels so overwhelming, because it's not just a bad apple. It's a system, and it's deeply embedded in the central banking and treasury governmental mechanisms.
The barter industry itself is a financial institution.
Yeah.
And some of the problems have been the fact there was lack of accountability and transparency. How do you see those issues being handled by our industry?
Transparency is a very tricky issue because, as a matter of economic warfare, there's kinds of transparency that make you vulnerable. So my recommendation would be, without understanding the specifics, because I'm not a barter expert, is if you could find through an association or through industry groups a way of creating transparency within the trusted members of the industry, but keep yourself protected from a greater economic warfare, that's what I would try and do. I would try and make transparency within a vetted and accredited club and protect yourself outside. Not to say that you don't do some transparency, but there can be layers. So I would be careful, because I think the number one issue for you with your customer base is going to be performance. And there are ways, certain kinds of transparency could make you vulnerable and hurt your performance. So I would try as much as possible to keep it within the club.
So I appreciate it. How long would the economy, the way it's been going, the way it's been shifting back and forth, I think, and I can speak for a lot of us in this room, in the professional barter industry, we've looked for the support from the higher-ups, from the financial institutes, things of that sort. How long would you say, since the economy is going like it is, to be able to come and speak to an organization that spends their time teaching and educating people, which our system is not even taught in colleges and schools yet? How much time do you think you spent that has encouraged you to start learning a little bit more about what our industry is doing for the nation, for the countries, and for locally? And is this something that, while you're out speaking, that you're looking at promoting the industry, what it is that we do?
Here's the most important thing to get into your spirit. The good news is you're the leader. The bad news is you're the leader. There's a traditional channel, and that traditional channel depends on a whole lot of things that are not compatible with what you're trying to do. You're trying to create liquidity on a basis that's economic. The traditional channel is trying to control. And so don't expect, there's, I haven't had a TV since 1984, but when I did have a TV, I used to watch Dallas. And there's a great scene when Bobby comes into his dad and he's whining about JR. I don't know, I'm hoping you all have seen Dallas. He's whining that JR has done some horrible thing, and his father looks at him, he says, "Boy," he says, "when are you going to learn? Nobody gives you power, you take it." So there's no one in the large entities, with rare exception, who's going to help you, because you're looking to bust open the channel. Okay, this is very simple. At the root of it, it's the big guys versus the little guys. And the big guys are subsidizing themselves by raking off the productivity of the little guy. Now, what the barter industry, for the most part, is looking to do is to help the little guy, or just help things be economic. The traditional channel is not based on fundamental economics. It's based on the central banking warfare model, and those are so they're optimizing geopolitically, but they're using force to do it. And so, in one sense, we're on our own. So what we need is, and I would never say that, I would never suggest that Rod go to Washington and say it this way, but what we need to do is we need to start building market share and taking market share from the pro-centralization team, if you will, and doing it in a way where we're protecting each other and thinking as a group, but we can't expect them to help. Now, I would think, as I'm going around or you're going around and marketing barter, that one of the most effective sales pitches that we all have is, it is now worth people's time to stop transacting the way they're transacting and start to find networks of trust. So if you look at eBay's success, if you look at the social network success like Facebook, people are starting to realize that there's real energy in going and learning these new ways. But again, they want to be part of something that's not just a transaction, it's a community. So what I would think about is how can you be part of building not only these new transaction networks, but be part of building new community networks, because people are feeling isolated and scared, and they want to be part of something. Does that answer your question? Okay.
What are your thoughts on decoupling? For a while there, it looked as if the euro and dollar, the decline in the U.S. economy wasn't really relevant to the euro, to the eurozone rather, or to the rest of the world. And then for a while, it looked like it was. Now I'm not sure where it is. So what are your thoughts on that? And also, where do you see the dollar going relative to other global currencies in the near term?
That's a very good question. The dollar has fallen some against the euro. It's back up now. It'll keep falling against the euro. We have a series of blocks of economy that depend on not decoupling. So if we decouple, there's a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in Asia who can be hurt. And what we've been watching, if you look at the bailouts or the other very liberal monetary policy of the dollar, we've been watching the same of economies around the world. They're trying to match our monetary policy, so if you will, all fiat currencies disintegrate together. And what we're really watching is not so much the dollar falling against other large fiat currencies, but large fiat currencies falling against real things, okay? And so that's what you're going to be watching. The $64 question is that the dollar fall has been very managed, and the things that have kept it going, the big thing that's kept it going is our military. So literally, we've got the satellite systems and we've got the nuclear bombs so that people have to buy treasuries whether they want to or not. And really, the $64 question is, can we continue to do that for the next, it's terrible move. Can we continue to do that for the next 2 years without a more overt military? I mean, can we do that without somebody dropping a nuclear bomb? And I don't know the answer to that.
In regards to the bailout, the $700 billion, Chris Dodd was on one of the Sunday shows, and it was point blank asked, what would be the consequences of not doing it in the next 5 days? And he refused to answer that question.
Right.
What do you think the consequences are of that? Because he wouldn't answer it.
We're in a situation where we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. If he doesn't get approval for the $700 billion, we run the risk of a real run on the money market funds. So the run will not be on the banks, it'll be on the money market funds. And there could be defaults in the trading portfolio, so you could see some of the big banks have some real trouble. The problem is, on the other side, the nature of what Paulson has requested has accelerated the Dodge and Cox epiphany. So more and more people are realizing, you know something, this financial system is fundamentally fraudulent, I want out. And so I would argue that Congress saying, wait a minute, no, we're not going to give a blank check, if anything, could be positive. Because unless there is some indication that there is a fundamental rule of law in this country, you could see a much worse run. So if I was in Washington, my recommendation would be to say no blank check. Because at some point we're either a nation of laws or we're not, and if we're not a nation of laws, then all the assets here have essentially almost no or little value. So my prediction is Congress will not give a blank check and we'll be much better off for it. But either way, we're looking at a fundamental loss in credibility to the whole system, and that's why I think the big issue is going to be what happens to the federal credit and what kind of overt military intervention will it require.
I understand the battle that you're proposing. I look at it more as an individual or community protectionism as far as controlling your own destiny. But to me, it seems like it's a throwback. Take the U.S. economy, take the U.S. back 100 years. It's almost a third world model. Is there there's a duality here possibly where we can work in both arenas and continue to prosper at one level, but certainly build a base
last thing we should do is go back to 100 years ago. If you look at self-sufficiency, it's much more applying new technology to reduce your expenses as opposed to investing money in the stock market to increase your yield. So it's much more focused on efficiency. The best thing I could show you was if you look at the two portfolios that I have in the before and after in the positioning audio seminar, what you'll see is the after portfolio is much more globalized and is much more focused on new technology. So it's, you know, I'm not talking about going into the woods and sitting and eating beans or anything. What I am saying is part of what we're watching, the spiral down, is a decrease in productivity. Now, some of that decrease just comes from being an aging population, but a lot of that decrease comes from an economy which is so dependent on government money that it's encouraging people to behave in very unproductive ways. And the reality is rebuilding that productivity has to come bottom up. And it has to come in every individual, it has to come in every household, it has to come locally, and the opportunity to rebuild is during a credit crunch, because then the small guys are cut off from money, and if we're going to circulate more bank deposits, fixed income investment, or equity locally, it's got to come with a significant increase in productivity. So the question is, how do we get that increase of productivity sufficient to make our local investments or network investments attractive to our own money? Because part of this is, as the large corporations misbehave, that's an opportunity for us to attract our own capital out of them and to smaller business and smaller guys. But that means the smaller business and smaller guys has to be worthy of that capital. Because if not, it's just going to go to New Zealand.
How do you see the alternatives to the blank check working themselves through in terms of priorities? So, what can we do first if we did not give the power to the blank check? How would we hold it?
What Paulson's got to do is find a way. What they want to do is they want to take all the assets that the financial community is having trouble pricing, and they want to move them into a bad bank. And the reason is it's literally like taking the cancer, putting it over here, and then these organizations can function cleanly without the confusion or the fear created by the assets in the bad bank. Now, the reality is he needs a way to do that without the global community being able to identify and prosecute the criminal liability that is inherent in the assets in the bad bank. Because if you take the files for all those assets, they're full of criminal liability. So how do you get everything off into the bad bank and keep it and resolve it and keep it obfuscated from the market? And I'll give you an example. When I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, we used to get lists of foreclosures, and it would say, you have 10 foreclosures on this block. And then I would fly to that place, and I'd go out in the block, and the block was empty. There are no houses there. Okay? So that's a little example, but multiply that by many times. How does Paulson keep the trains running on time and keep the financial system liquid, resolve all that fraud, and keep it non-transparent to all the people who need to keep trusting the system? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
That was
Very good questions.
Beautiful, very scary.